Quotes. The following is a collection of miscellaneous quotes which I have come across in researching, which led me to believe that progressivism was an immoral, ahistorical, economically illiterate worldview. If the government didn't have a monopoly on security, only rich people would be able to have security, just like when the government got out of other businesses. The only cars produced were limousines, the only clothes produced were tuxedos, and the only food produced was foie gras, by Michael Malice. I plead for greater liberty and a more open world, not because I believe one system happens to be more efficient than another, but because those things provide a setting that unleashes individual creativity as no other system can. They spur dynamism that has led to human, economic, scientific, and technological advances. At its core, belief in capitalism is belief in mankind. My aim is freedom and voluntary relations in all fields. By Johan Norberg, in defense of global capitalism. To kill one man is to be guilty of a capital crime. To kill 10 men is to increase the guilt tenfold. To kill 100 men is to increase it 100-fold. This the rulers of the earth all recognize, and yet when it comes to the greatest crime, waging war on another state, they praise it. If a man, on seeing a little black, were to say it is black, but on seeing a lot of black were to say it is white, it would be clear that such a man could not distinguish black and white. So those who recognize a small crime as such but do not recognize the wickedness of the greatest crime of all cannot distinguish right and wrong. By Mosey, 470 to 391 BC, Condemnation of the Offensive War 1, Book 5. The progress of civilization has meant the reduction of employment, not its increase. It is because we have become increasingly wealthy as a nation that we have been able to virtually eliminate child labor. By Henry Hazlitt, in Economics in One Lesson. If this were truly a white supremacist society, being called a white supremacist would be a badge of honor, not a professional death sentence. By Thomas E. Woods, Jr. Private property isn't about selfishness so much as it's about creative control. Someone might want to have their own business, not because they're greedy, but because they have a vision of how they want things to go that won't be realized if everyone else gets a say in it. By Chris Freeman, Professor, John Chambers College of Business and Economics at WVU. Quick objection to socialism. Just as some students thrive in group projects and others don't, some workers thrive in cooperatives and others don't. So we shouldn't insist that every workplace be collectivized in some way. Let workers choose whatever arrangement suits them best. By Chris Freeman. Some people might say, well, the problem is, if we can sell kidneys, then really desperately poor people would sell their kidneys and richer people wouldn't, and you'd exploit them. Part of my response is to say, if you have a person who's in such dire straits that their best option is to sell a kidney, and you take that away from them, you're a horrible human being who doesn't care about social justice. Your moral sense is completely warped. I hope you're not voting. It's a forceful thing to say, but it's true. This is a horrible thing for that human being to have to do, but it's also their best option. Which means that if you take that away, they're gonna do something even worse than that. By Jason Brennan, professor and author of Markets Without Limits, from an episode of Keith Knight's Don't Tread on Anyone podcast. Against the broader background of world history, however, a very different lesson might be that no people of any color can be trusted with unbridled power over any other people, for such power has been grossly abused by whatever race, class, or political authority has held that power, whether under ancient despotism or modern totalitarianism, as well as under serfdom, slavery, or other forms of oppression. It was not because people thought slavery was right that it persisted for thousands of years. It persisted largely because people did not think about the rightness or wrongness of it at all. By Thomas Sowell, from Black Rednecks and White Liberals. The state represents violence in a concentrated and organized form. The individual has a soul, But as the state is a soulless machine, it can never be weaned from violence to which it owes its very existence. By Mahatma Gandhi, in Interview with Nirmal Kumar Bose, November 9 and 10, 1934, Modern Review. Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, became one of the wealthiest men in the world by figuring out how to cut the price of just about everything to the benefit of everyone, but especially of lower-income consumers. That's one of the other virtues of the free market. It rewards people who can figure out how to supply products and services that might have originally only been affordable to the wealthy so cheaply that just about anyone can afford and enjoy them. Henry Ford became wealthy by producing cheaper and better quality automobiles. John D. Rockefeller became wealthy by selling refined kerosene and other oil industry products cheaper and cheaper for decades. Cornelius Vanderbilt got his start in business by managing a steamship business on the Hudson River in which the ride was free, making money by selling food and drinks on board, and on and on. For their efforts, such men have been denigrated by the enemies of economic freedom, including various politicians, government bureaucrats, socialist ideologues in academe, journalism, and elsewhere, as robber barons. Of course, they did not rob anyone. Unlike government, they could not force anyone to buy their products. They had to persuade people to buy them by making them cheaper and better. Only government can rob you of your hard-earned money by threatening imprisonment for refusal to pay what it demands of you, for services or products that you may have no need for whatsoever, and whose existence you may even deeply resent. It's called tax evasion, a crime that is punished under federal and state law by fines, imprisonment, or both. That is why the most menial local government tax-collecting bureaucrat can have more power over your life than the wealthiest business person in the world. Business people must persuade people to purchase more of their products or services. Unelected government bureaucrats can order you to shut down your business, take your kids out of school, or quit your job and get the police to enforce the orders, as all Americans learned during the pandemic of 2020 to 22. By Thomas J. DiLorenzo, in The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. The standard theory of monopoly within the mainstream of the economics profession is that monopolies increase prices and reduce production levels compared to competitive industries. So I gathered historical economic data on prices and production for 17 of the industries accused of monopolization during the congressional debates over the Sherman Act. Surprisingly, no other economist had apparently ever done this. What I found was that while real, inflation-adjusted gross domestic product, GDP, increased by about 24% from 1880 to 1890, the industries accused of, quote, restricting output increased their production by 175% on average, 7 times more than the economy in general. For example, steel production rose by 258%, zinc 156%, coal 153%, steel rails 142%, petroleum 79%, and sugar 75%. And during that same time period, as the Consumer Price Index, CPI, fell by 7%, the trusts that were accused of monopolization dropped their prices by far more. The price of steel rail fell by 53%, refined sugar became 22% cheaper, lead declined in price by 12%, and zinc by 20%, for example. This trend of production in these industries, dominated by trusts, the supposed natural monopolies, outstripping GDP as a whole and prices declining faster in these industries than the CPI continued on for the next decade as well. By Thomas J. DiLorenzo in The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. My case for pacifism, to recap, comes down to 3 simple premises. The first 2 are empirical. Premise number 1. The short-run costs of war are clearly awful. Empirical claim about immediate effects of war. Premise number 2. The long-run benefits of war are highly uncertain. Empirical claim about people's ability to accurately forecast the long-run effects of war. These empirical claims imply pacifism when combined with a bland moral premise, premise number 3. For a war to be morally justified, the expected long-run benefits have to substantially exceed its short-run costs. Moral claim, inspired by Judith Jarvis Thomson's forced organ donation hypothetical. By Bryan Caplan in How Evil Are Politicians? Essays on Demagoguery. There is also a prima facie similarity between the democratic idea of citizens controlling the government through their votes and the capitalist idea of customers controlling companies through their purchasing decisions. Both politicians and business people have to cater to the masses. The difference, again, is that the capitalist idea is the version that actually makes sense. You actually have an incentive to pay attention and figure out which company is best, because then you can actually get that company's product. By contrast, as discussed previously, voters have no such incentive. However diligent and rational you are in your voting decisions, you still get whatever the majority of other people vote for, so there's no point in wasting time trying to figure out who the best candidate is. This explains why markets tend to be much more responsive to consumers than governments are. If you haven't noticed that, try calling up a government agency sometime. Tell them you're very unhappy with their services and you want a refund. See how far you get. By Michael Huemer in Privatized Law and Order. Here's the one-sentence argument for utilitarian libertarianism. Compared with other institutions, markets do the best job of promoting social happiness without depending on people trying to promote social happiness. Markets solve two major problems for utilitarianism. First, most people don't desire to maximize social happiness as opposed to their own happiness and the happiness of a relatively small circle of family and friends. Second, even if people desire to maximize social happiness, they generally don't know how. As individuals, we know very little about the distribution of the world's resources and particular people's desires for those resources. Consequently, we lack the information we need to produce an optimal match between resources and people. But markets provide both the incentives and the information that people need to advance the happiness of strangers. Markets generally make our moral and cognitive limitations work for us rather than against us. They channel self-interest toward the public interest. By Chris Freeman in Arguments for Liberty. Listing the main ways that society appears to treat men less fairly than women requires only a little more reflection to complete. Topping the list? Men are overrepresented at the bottom levels of society. They do most of the nasty, dangerous work, are much more likely to be homeless or imprisoned, and much more likely to kill themselves. Men spend much more time on the job than women. The law heavily favors women in child custody and child support disputes. Men are more likely to be victims of violent crime. Men are much more likely to die in combat. In fact, during serious military conflicts, they face military slavery, the draft. Women view men as success objects. By Bryan Caplan in Don't Be a Feminist, Essays on Genuine Justice. Free markets are awesome because they give businesses incentives to do good stuff that sounds bad. Governments are awful because they give politicians incentives to do bad stuff that sounds good. Since the correlation between what is good and what sounds good is quite low, this is a huge deal. By Bryan Caplan. The rapid economic advance that we have come to expect seems in a large measure to be the result of this inequality and to be impossible without it. Progress at such a fast rate cannot proceed on a uniform front but must take place in echelon fashion. At any stage of this process, there will always be many things we already know how to produce, but which are still too expensive to provide for more than a few. All the conveniences of a comfortable home, of our means of transportation and communication, of entertainment and enjoyment, we could produce at first only in limited quantities. But it was in doing this that we gradually learned to make them or similar things at a much smaller outlay of resources and thus became able to supply them to the great majority. A large part of the expenditure of the rich though not intended for that end, thus serves to defray the cost of the experimentation with new things that, as a result, can later be made available to the poor, by F.A. Hayek in The Constitution of Liberty. Mutual aid was particularly popular among the poor and the working class. For instance, in New York City in 1909, 40% of families earning less than $1,000 a year, little more than the living wage, had members who were in mutual aid societies. Ethnicity, however, was an even greater predictor of mutual aid membership than income. The new immigrants, such as the Germans, Bohemians, and Russians, many of whom were Jews, participated in mutual aid societies at approximately twice the rate of native whites and 6 times the rate of the Irish. By the 1920s, at least 1 out of every 3 males was a member of a mutual aid society. Members of societies carried over $9 billion worth of life insurance by 1920. During the same period, lodges dominated the field of health insurance. Numerous lodges offered unemployment benefits. Some black fraternal lodges, taking note of the sporadic nature of African American employment at the time, allowed members to receive unemployment benefits even if they were up to 6 months behind in dues. Under lodge medicine, the price for health care was low. Members typically paid $2, about a day's wage, to have yearly access to a doctor's care. Minor surgery was frequently included in this fee. Non-lodge members typically paid about $2 every doctor's visit during this time period. By Joshua Fulton in Welfare Before the Welfare State. The real bosses in the capitalist system of market economy are the consumers. They, by their buying and by their abstention from buying, decide who should own the capital and run the plants. They determine what should be produced and in what quantity and quality. Their attitudes result either in profit or in loss for the enterpriser. They make poor men rich and rich men poor. They are no easy bosses. By Ludwig von Mises in Bureaucracy. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? By Karl Marx and Frederick Engels in The Communist Manifesto. What makes wages rise and renders the material conditions of the wage earners more satisfactory is improvement in the technological equipment. American wages are higher than wages in other countries because the capital invested per head of the worker is greater, and the plants are thereby in the position to use the most efficient tools and machines. What is called the American way of life is the result of the fact that the United States has put fewer obstacles in the way of saving and capital accumulation than other nations. There is only one way that leads to an improvement of the standard of living for the wage-earning masses, viz., the increase in the amount of capital invested. By Ludwig von Mises in Planning for Freedom and 16 other essays and addresses. The number of blacks in professional, technical, and other high-level occupations more than doubled in the decade preceding the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In other occupations, gains by blacks were greater during the 1940s, when there was practically no civil rights legislation, than during the 1950s. In various skilled trades, the income of blacks relative to whites more than doubled between 1936 and 1959. Affirmative action hiring pressures make it costly to have no minority employees, but continuing affirmative action pressures at the promotion and discharge phases also make it costly to have minority employees who do not work out well. The net effect is to increase the demand for highly qualified minority employees while decreasing the demand for less qualified minority employees or for those without a sufficient track record to reassure employers. By Thomas Sowell in Civil Rights, Rhetoric or Reality. Won't the mafia take over? It is paradoxical that the fear of rule by organized crime families causes people to support the state, which is the most organized and criminal association in human history. Even if it were true that under market anarchy people had to pay protection money and occasionally get whacked, this would be a drop in the bucket compared to the taxation and wartime deaths caused by governments. But even this concedes too much. For the mob derives its strength from government, not the free market. All of the businesses traditionally associated with organized crime, gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, drug dealing, are prohibited or heavily regulated by the state. In market anarchy, true professionals would drive out such unscrupulous competitors. By Robert P. Murphy in Chaos Theory. Capitalism is essentially a system of mass production for the satisfaction of the needs of the masses. It pours a horn of plenty upon the common man. It has raised the average standard of living to a height never dreamed of in earlier ages. It has made accessible to millions of people enjoyments which a few generations ago were only within the reach of a small elite. By Ludwig von Mises in The Anti-Capitalist Mentality. The socialist society would have to forbid capitalist acts between consenting adults. By Robert Nozick in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. We do not usually make people better off by reducing their alternatives. By David D. Friedman in Hidden Order: The Economics of Everyday Life. Knowledge of the strengths of blacks has been ignored or repressed in a different way as well. Few people today are aware that the ghettos in many cities were far safer places 2 generations ago than they are today, both for blacks and for whites. Incredulity often greets stories by older blacks as to their habit of sleeping out on fire escapes, or on rooftops, or in public parks on hot summer nights. Many of those same people would not dare to walk through those same parks today in broad daylight. In the 1930s, whites went regularly to Harlem at night, stayed until the wee hours of the morning, and then stood on the streets to hail cabs to take them home. Today, not only would very few whites dare to do this, very few cabs would dare to be cruising ghetto streets in the wee hours of the morning. Why should discussion of positive achievements by blacks ever be a source of embarrassment, much less resentment, on the part of black leaders? Because many of these positive achievements occurred in ways that completely undermined the civil rights vision. If crime is a product of poverty and discrimination, as they say endlessly, why was there so much less of it when poverty and discrimination were much worse than today? If massive programs are the only hope to reduce violence in the ghetto, why was there so much less violence long before anyone ever thought of these programs? By Thomas Sowell in Civil Rights, Rhetoric, or Reality. The reason we are richer now than we were in the past is of course not because we have more resources. If anything, we have fewer. Instead, it's because we are more knowledgeable about how best to employ existing resources. But typically when we learn how to make something new, such as a cellular phone, it is very expensive to produce it on a per-unit basis. The rich buy the first units, get all of the benefits at first, but then also pay all of the upfront costs. They thereby pay for the basic infrastructure that makes it available for all. The rich pay for experimentation and innovation and fund entrepreneurs in finding ways to market to the poor, though this is not the intention of the rich. The reason wealthy countries today can provide what used to be luxuries, TVs, electricity, flush toilets, for all, is because in the past these countries allowed such goods to be provided for just a few, rather than prohibited because not all can have them. By Jason Brennan in Why It's Okay to Want to Be Rich. If human beings are so careless, stupid, and malicious that they cannot be trusted to do the right thing on their own, how would the situation be improved by taking a subset of those very same careless, stupid, and malicious human beings and giving them societal permission to forcibly control all the others? By Larkin Rose in The Most Dangerous Superstition. Perhaps most telling is that if you suggest to the average person that maybe God does not exist, he will likely respond with less emotion and hostility than if you bring up the idea of life without government. This indicates which religion people are more deeply emotionally attached to, and which religion they actually believe in more firmly. In fact, they believe so deeply in government that they do not even recognize it as being a belief at all. By Larkin Rose in The Most Dangerous Superstition. If, for example, someone has a right to housing, and housing comes only from the knowledge, skills, and efforts of other people, it means that one person has the right to force another person to build him a house. By Larkin Rose in The Most Dangerous Superstition. We now have the first complete data set of all suicide terrorist attacks around the world from 1980 to 2009. Research on who becomes a suicide terrorist showed that virtually none could be diagnosed as mentally ill. While many were religious and, most striking, nearly all emerged from communities resisting foreign military occupation. From 1980 to 2003, there were 345 completed suicide terrorist attacks by 524 suicide terrorists who actually killed themselves on a mission to kill others, half of whom are secular. The world leader was the Tamil Tigers, a secular Hindu group who carried out more attacks than Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ, during this period. Further, at least a third of the suicide attacks in predominantly Muslim countries were carried out by secular terrorist groups, such as the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, in Turkey. Instead of religion, what over 95% of all suicide terrorist attacks before 2004 had in common was a strategic goal: to compel a democratic state to withdraw combat forces that are threatening territory that the terrorists prize. From Lebanon to Sri Lanka, to the West Bank to Chechnya, the central goal of every suicide terrorist campaign has been to resist military occupation by a democracy. It was the Hindu, avowedly anti-religious Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, LTTE, in Sri Lanka, whose 157 suicide terrorists totaled more than Hamas and all other Palestinian suicide groups combined. Of the Palestinian suicide terrorists, more than a third were from secular groups such as the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP. Of the suicide terrorists associated with Hezbollah in Lebanon during the 1980s, only 21% were Islamic fundamentalists, while 71% were communists and socialists. 8% were Christians. In Turkey, 100% of the PKK's suicide attackers were secular. Overall, Islamic fundamentalism cannot account for over half of the known affiliations of the 524 total suicide terrorists from 1980 to 2003. 184 were from Islamic fundamentalist groups, 35% comprising 73 Al-Qaeda, 5 Lebanese, 5 Kashmiri rebels, 69 Hamas, 34 Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and 236 from secular groups, 45% comprising 157 Tamil Tigers, 42 Al-Aqsa, 22 Lebanese, 15 PKK, while 21% had unknown ideological affiliations. Further, notice that there are no suicide attackers from Iran, one of the largest Islamic fundamentalist populations in the world, with a population greater than Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Jordan, and Syria combined. By Robert Pape and James K. Feldman in Cutting the Fuse. Then the fighters realized that the gang in the White House could not see things clearly and that their leader, that idiot they obey, was claiming that we envied their lifestyle, when the truth, which this pharaoh would like to hide, is that we are attacking them because of their injustice towards the Muslim world, and especially Palestine and Iraq, as well as their occupation of the land of the two sanctuaries. When the fighters saw this, they decided to come out of the shadows and to take the fight into their territory, into their homes. By Osama bin Laden, in Al-Qaeda in its own words. The human tragedy reaches its climax in the fact that after all the exertions and sacrifices of hundreds of millions of people and the victories of the righteous cause, we have still not found peace or security, and that we lie in the grip of even worse perils than those we have surmounted. By Winston Churchill in The Gathering Storm. Media pundits have been gushing over Biden's alleged accomplishment. But less than 1 year ago, on August 29, 2021, also in Kabul, 10 entirely innocent civilians were destroyed by a U.S. drone strike on the basis of, quote, evidence that the target was driving a white Toyota Corolla and seemed to be acting, quote, suspiciously. By Lori Calhoun, author of We Kill Because We Can. After America emerged as the undisputed leader of the West in 1945, the shocks, reversals, and humiliations at the hands of Stalin were greater than those that had caused Britain to declare war in 1939. America, however, chose a different course. Embracing the wisdom of George Kennan, America pursued a policy of containment and conscious avoidance of a Third World War. When Stalin trashed the Yalta Agreement, terrorizing the peoples of Poland and Eastern Europe for whom Britain had gone to war, America was stunned and sickened, but issued no ultimata. When Moscow blockaded Berlin in violation of Allied rights, Truman responded with an airlift, not armored divisions or atom bombs. When Stalin's agents carried out the Prague coup in 1948, Truman did not see in Czechoslovakia an issue that justified war, as Churchill had when the Czechs were forced to give up the Sudetenland. America's answer was NATO, drawing a red line across Europe that the West could defend as Britain should have done in March of 1939, instead of handing out the insane war guarantee to Poland. And where the British had failed to line up a Russian alliance before giving its war guarantee, America enlisted 10 European allies before committing herself to defend West Germany. Unlike Churchill in the 1930s, American leaders of the late 1940s and 1950s believed that, while the fate of Poland and Czechoslovakia was tragic, both were beyond any U.S. vital interest. From 1949 to 1989, the American Army never crossed the Yalta Line. When East Germans rose in 1953 and Hungarians in 1956, Eisenhower declined to act. In 1959, Ike welcomed the Butcher of Budapest to Camp David. When Khrushchev built the Berlin Wall, Kennedy called up the reserves, then sent them home after a year. In the missile crisis of 1962, Kennedy cut a secret deal to take U.S. missiles out of Turkey for Khrushchev's taking Russian missiles out of Cuba. When the Prague Spring was crushed in 1968, LBJ did nothing. U.S. inaction was not due to cowardice, but cold calculation as to what was worth risking war with a nuclear-armed Soviet Union and what was not worth risking war. When the Polish workers' movement, Solidarity, was crushed in 1981, Ronald Reagan denounced the repression, but he neither broke diplomatic relations with Warsaw nor imposed economic sanctions. Eisenhower and Reagan were not Chamberlains, but neither were they Churchills. Who ruled in the capitals east of the Elbe was not to them a vital U.S. interest worth a war. By Patrick J. Buchanan in Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. Drone strikes conducted by the United States during a 5-month-long campaign in Afghanistan caused the deaths of unintended targets nearly 9 out of 10 times, leaked intelligence documents suggest. The apparent 10% success rate with regards to a specific span in America's drone war is among the most damning revelations to surface so far as the result of a series of articles published by The Intercept on Thursday this week, which rely on classified and confidential intelligence documents supplied by an unknown source. From Obama-led drone strikes kill innocents 90% of the time by Washington Times, October 2015. This is capitalism's trump card. It encourages creativity and empathy and puts them at the service of the wants and needs of the people. The inequality the socialist left despises isn't created by the entrepreneur, it's created by us. The proud boast of democratic socialism is that it puts the people in charge of the economy. What control do you have over the post office or the DMV? We vote in elections every 2 or 4 years, but as consumers we exercise our choices daily, directly through the market. The free market is far more reflective of popular consent than democratic socialism. We don't have to extend democracy from the political to the economic sphere because we already have it. Capitalism, not socialism, is the true form of social justice. By Dinesh D'Souza in Trump Card: Beating Socialism, Corruption, and the Deep State. The annual cost of federal regulations in the United States increased to more than $1.75 trillion in 2008. Had every U.S. household paid an equal share of the federal regulatory burden, each would have owed $15,586 in 2008. By comparison, the federal regulatory burden exceeds by 50% private spending on healthcare, which equaled $10,500 per household in 2008. While all citizens and businesses pay some portion of these costs, the distribution of the burden of regulations is quite uneven. The portion of regulatory costs that falls initially on businesses was $8,086 per employee in 2008. Small businesses, defined as firms employing fewer than 20 employees, bear the largest burden of federal regulations. As of 2008, small businesses face an annual regulatory cost of $10,585 per employee, which is 36% higher than the regulatory cost facing large firms, defined as firms with 500 or more employees. By Nicole V. Crane and W. Mark Crane in The Impact of Regulatory Costs on Small Firms. The Economic Legacy of Slavery. What was accomplished by the enslavement of untold millions of human beings in countries around the world? No doubt, particular projects here and there were the fruits of slave labor, but it would be difficult to make the more general case that slavery advanced the economic level of those societies in which it existed on a mass scale. The American South, for example, was by no means the most economically dynamic region of the country, either during or after the era of slavery. It was in fact the poorest. Brazil, which imported several times as many slaves as the United States, remained a relatively backward country until the large-scale European immigration that began after the era of slavery was over. The slave societies of North Africa and the Middle East, which absorbed even more millions of slaves than the Western Hemisphere, lagged conspicuously behind the technological and economic level of the West, both during and after the end of slavery, until oil, not slaves, raised their standards of living in the modern era. In Europe, it was the nations in the western region of the continent, where slavery was abolished first, that led the continent and the world into the modern industrial age. In many parts of the world, slaves were luxuries, or at least domestic amenities, rather than capital investments intended to yield a profit. A large retinue of slaves was a display of wealth and power, whether in ancient Rome, China, Africa, Thailand, Tibet, or elsewhere. In regions where slaves were part of a lifestyle, and this included much of the Islamic world, it can hardly be surprising that slavery did not create any notable economic development. That was not its role. Moreover, even in societies where slaves were intended to produce profits for slave owners, it is by no means apparent that those profits played any major role beyond the current consumption of those slave owners. By Thomas Sowell in Race and Culture. The problem is this: every flaw in consumers is worse in voters. You might object, that's obvious, they're the same people. That's exactly the point that advocates for government corrections of market failure are missing, folks. In artificial laboratory settings, and sometimes in real-world choice settings, people are bad at making decisions. but they are better at choosing in markets where they have prices and brand names than those same people trying to choose in democratic political settings where advertising is intentionally misleading and party brand names are almost meaningless. By Michael Munger, in Every Flaw in Consumers is Worse in Voters, Part 2. So, this is the essential paradox of regulation. To favor increasing regulation, you have to think the unorganized mass of consumers, taxpayers, and common public will generally be more effective in lobbying for their interests than organized, highly motivated special interest groups who keep offices in Washington, D.C. You have to think that the people who enjoy concentrated benefits and can spread their costs onto others will be less effective than the masses who suffer from diffused costs. By Jason Brennan in Why It's Okay to Want to Be Rich. Our schools provide many hours of lessons on climate change, but I wonder how many teachers, let alone pupils, are aware that climate-related deaths have decreased by as much as 97% over the past 100 years, as the OFDA and CRED data show. From Why Don't We Ever Hear the Good News About Climate? On Spiked.com, January 9, 2023. We're vulnerable to politically motivated reasoning. The unconscious goal of our political deliberation is not to find the truth, but rather to protect our identity as a loyal member of our political team, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Socialist, and so on. We are distressingly good at dismissing, downgrading, and explaining away evidence that indicates we're on the wrong side of the political aisle. By Christopher Freeman in Why It's Okay to Ignore Politics. Without a state, we read, Somalia under statelessness descended into a Hobbesian state of nature where life is nasty, brutish, and short. Then, after 2 whole paragraphs on the situation in Somalia, we get study questions. If you look really, really closely, you may detect a very slight bias in these questions. Very slight, I tell you. 1. Which is preferable, bad government or no government? 2. Why hasn't Somalia without a state become the paradise that libertarians anticipate? Now for one thing, was there ever a libertarian who predicted that a stateless Somalia, or a stateless anywhere else, would be a paradise? More importantly, if we're going to get a picture that's worth anything of life in Somalia without the state, the correct comparison to make is not between Somalia and the United States, the comparison most writers like this are implicitly making, but between Somalia and comparable African countries. And on that front, Somalia, during its stateless period, comes out pretty darn well. In most metrics of living standards, it held steady or improved. In the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization in 2008, Professor Benjamin Powell and his colleagues wrote, quote, This paper's main contribution to the literature has been to compare Somalia's living standards to those of 41 other sub-Saharan African countries, both before and after the collapse of the national government. We find that Somalia's living standards have generally improved and that they compare relatively favorably with many existing African states. Importantly, we find that Somali living standards have often improved, not just in absolute terms, but also relative to other African countries since the collapse of the Somali central government. End quote. Economist Peter Leeson in Anarchy Unbound, Cambridge University Press, reports similar findings. Yes, Somalia ranked low in some categories during the stateless period, but that's where it ranked before statelessness too, and if anything, it actually made progress in those categories. Life expectancy was up, for instance, and infant mortality was down. By Thomas E. Woods, Jr. There's plenty to say regarding Sweden. Its socialist policies were made possible by wealth created under an essentially capitalist economy. As recently as the 1950s, remember, governments spent less as a percentage of GDP in Sweden than in the U.S. Swedes earn about 50% more in the U.S. in our supposedly wicked economy, and since Sweden's explosion of social welfare spending, there have been 0 jobs created on net in the private sector. By Thomas E. Woods, Jr. The funny thing is that if the Sanderses and Ocasio-Cortezes of the world made the US more like Sweden, what would really happen? They haven't updated their perception of Sweden, and if the US became more like us, the United States would have to have more free markets, more free trade, pension reform with private accounts, a national school voucher system with freedom of choice, and public funding going to private schools as well. Low corporate taxes and no taxes on wealth, property, and inheritance. Be careful what you wish for. By Johan Norberg in Lessons from Sweden. If men were like ants, there would be no interest in human freedom. If individual men, like ants, were uniform, interchangeable, devoid of specific personality traits of their own, then who would care whether they were free or not? Who indeed would care if they lived or died? The glory of the human race is the uniqueness of each individual, the fact that every person, though similar in many ways to others, possesses a completely individuated personality of his own. It is the fact of each person's uniqueness, the fact that no two people can be wholly interchangeable, that makes each and every man irreplaceable, and that makes us to care whether he lives or dies, whether he is happy or oppressed. And finally, it is the fact that these unique personalities need freedom for their full development that constitutes one of the major arguments for a free society. By Murray in Rothbard in Egalitarianism as Revolt Against Nature. The most immediate effect of licensing is to restrict the number of practitioners because of the higher entry costs involved in meeting the qualifications of the activity. Some licenses, as in the cases of cosmeticians and barbers, require many months of schooling. Others require the installation of costly health and safety equipment. Still others demand the purchase of the license or certificate of authorization from an incumbent practitioner that can cost millions of dollars, as was the case when interstate trucking was highly regulated. Further, some jurisdictions issue only a fixed number of licenses or authorizations. All of these requirements raise the cost of entry, which naturally leads to a smaller number of practitioners. Restricting that number is only the initial effect of licensing. A secondary effect is that the price of the good or service offered is higher than it would otherwise be. The result of restricting entry to a business or occupation, and probably the primary intent of licensing, is to raise the incomes of incumbent practitioners. Evidence supports this self-interested behavior. 1. Most licensure laws are the result of intense lobbying by incumbents, not of consumers demanding more protection from incompetent or unscrupulous practitioners. 2. When incumbents in an unlicensed trade lobby for licensing, or when those in one already licensed lobby for higher entry requirements, they virtually always seek a grandfather clause that exempts them from meeting the new requirements, leaving the burden of the higher entry costs to be borne mainly by new entrants. 3. Practitioner violations of the licensing codes, such as price cutting and extra hours, are nearly always reported to the licensing board by the incumbents rather than by customers. By Walter E. Williams in Race and Economics. By contrast, those who are promoting process goals are seeking to have incremental trade-offs made by individuals directly experiencing both the benefits and the costs of their own decisions. Those who are promoting outcome goals are seeking to create categorical priorities chosen by third parties and imposed by government compulsion on those who directly experience both the benefits and the costs. Is it of no consequence if everyone's income, education, and life expectancy double over some span of time, even if that necessarily increases the gaps? Why should eliminating gaps be the goal when different individuals and groups do not want the same things, or do not have the same priorities or urgencies about these gaps? People who depict markets as cold, impersonal institutions and their own notions as humane and compassionate have it directly backwards. It is when people make their own economic decisions, taking into account costs that matter to themselves and known only to themselves, that this knowledge becomes part of the trade-offs they choose, whether as consumers or producers. By Thomas Sowell in Discrimination and Disparities. Euphemisms are another form of insinuation that enables ideas to bypass factual or analytical tests. When John Rawls, in his A Theory of Justice, repeatedly referred to outcomes that society can arrange, these euphemisms finessed aside the plain fact that only government has the power to override millions of people's mutually agreed transactions terms. Interior decorators arrange. Governments compel. It is not a subtle distinction, nor is Rawls the only income redistributionist to evade the reality of compulsion, which is to say, the loss of millions of people's freedom to make their own decisions about their own lives when an inequality of economic outcomes is replaced by a far more dangerous increased inequality of power. By Thomas Sowell in Discrimination and Disparities. Serious empirical analyses done by everyone from myself to the Manhattan Institute's Heather McDonald to www.killedbypolice.net, an entire web resource set up to study this topic, invariably conclude that fewer than 1,200 people of all races and sexes are killed annually by American police officers. In a typical year, such as the representative year of 2015, roughly 258 of these people will be black. It is true that the black percentage of the individuals killed by police, 22 to 24%, is slightly higher than the 13 to 14% representation of blacks in the overall U.S. population. However, this roughly 10% gap is wholly explained by the fact that the black crime rate, violent crime rate, arrest rate, and police encounter rate are all significantly higher than the equivalent rates for whites. There is no evidence for any of Black Lives Matter's major claims. By Wilfred Reilly in Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. Rather than picking between two racialist sides and fighting for one or the other, American citizens can simply begin telling the truth about race relations. There is no race war going on in the USA, and there certainly is no epidemic of white-on-black crime. In fact, interracial crimes on an annual basis have been consistently 75 to 85% of black-on-white for the past 30 years. More importantly, there is no horrifying epidemic of interracial crimes of any variety because 84% of white murder victims and 93% of black murder victims are killed by a mundane member of their own race. We see constant media coverage of Barbecue Becky, Permit Patty, Coupon Carl, and George Zimmerman, not because these people are everywhere, but because the corporate media have an agenda to push. We should stop taking this agenda seriously today. By Wilfred Reilly in Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. The main points of the last two chapters were that cultural differences between groups 1. Exist and 2. Predict success. A corollary to these points is that, when all cultural differences are adjusted for, contemporary racism has almost nothing to do with the major problems faced by minority Americans today. This is, of course, a wildly provocative statement. The idea that the United States today is an institutionally or structurally prejudiced society is a cornerstone of modern liberal thought. The Black Lives Matter movement alone has staged 2,406 major marches against racism during the past few years. However, any serious claim that contemporary or recent bigotry is the cause of phenomena, such as the 75% black illegitimacy rate, founders on 3 rocks. First, these problems did not exist among blacks or anyone else when racism was much worse. These problems do not exist for successful dark-skinned African and Asian immigrants to the USA, and many or most such problems do exist among poor whites, perhaps the most genuinely neglected group in America, to roughly the same extent that they do among blacks. By Wilfred Reilly in Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. Imagine virtuous Vanny cares deeply about others and is willing to do whatever it takes to save lives. She believes that processed sugar is a scourge, killing Americans. So one day she packs a pistol, invades the local 7-Eleven, and declares, "This here gun says you can't sell big gulps anymore." Principled Peter believes that you don't give enough money to charity. You're living high while people die. One day he sends you an email. FYI, I hacked into your bank account. I transferred a third of it to poor single moms. Decent Danny thinks you should buy American rather than German cars. After all, your fellow citizens provide you with roads, schools, and police. You owe them some business. He finds you shopping at a foreign dealer, pulls out a taser and says, "You know what? I'll let you buy that BMW, but only if you first pay me $3,000. You'd probably regard Vanny, Peter, and Danny as criminals. How dare they treat you like that? You'd want the police to arrest them. But there's a puzzle here. While the police would indeed arrest Vanny, Peter, and Danny, they're also happy to help other people. Bureaucrats in Washington, Berlin, or Ottawa do the same things Vanny, Peter, and Danny want to do. So this set of examples suggests a few questions. What, if anything, explains why it's wrong for Peter to take a third of your income but not wrong for the government tax office to do so? What, if anything, justifies the Food and Drug Administration in determining what you can and can't eat but forbids Vanny from doing so? In general, governments claim the right to do things ordinary people may not do. What, if anything, justifies that? This is one of the central questions in political philosophy. By Jason Brennan in Political Philosophy, an Introduction. For people seeking facts rather than political or ideological goals, there are many factual tests that might be applied in order to see if the wealth of the wealthy is derived from the poverty of the poor. One way might be to see if countries with many billionaires, either absolutely or relative to the size of the population, have higher or lower standards of living among the rest of their people. The United States, for example, has more billionaires than there are in the entire continent of Africa, plus the Middle East. But even Americans living in conditions officially defined as poverty usually have a higher standard of living than that of most of the people in Africa and the Middle East. By Thomas Sowell in Social Justice Fallacies. Leftists, the ones who are anti-state but also support social safety nets, could have most everything they want in an anarchist society in the form of mutual aid societies. Those are the types of leftists that are worth reaching out to. By Ace Archist.
Hey you all, it's fundraising time again at the Libertarian Institute. We try not to do this to you too often, but business is business after all. I got a great group of guys and a gal at the Institute, and I gotta pay them. So just go to libertarianinstitute.org/donate to pick your price and help out. We've got some great kickbacks too, books and shirts. Great ones. That's libertarianinstitute.org/donate. And thank you all very much.